All right, I am going to attempt to, not the way you're seeing it right now, I'm going to attempt to cover all of chapter 37 or issues of the 1950s. So it depends on which class ever ends up viewing this, how it correlates with whatever you're doing. If you are an AP student, it correlates with chapter 37. There are certain slides that I will skip over because I'm covering them in different sections of the book. For example, anything dealing with civil rights, I'm going to do as a unit unto itself. So this is really just a look at, it's one of those cultural snapshots that we do. It's a look at how the world was working in the 1950s. And again, remember, economically and socially, we often compare the 1920s to the 1950s to the 1980s. Both of these time periods are periods after major wars, with the exception of the 1980s. You could say, because Vietnam had occurred in the late 60s and the 70s, that it's kind of feeding off that. You also have periods of cultural change. You have periods of increased wealth overall for the nation as a whole, and they're just sort of adjustments, growing times. You have Republican leadership, so you have pro-business leadership. Here we go. You'll see where, if this had been done in class, I have a bajillion and one YouTube clips. If you download the slides, the clips should still be there, and you're welcome to watch any of them. So here's what happens. After the war, there becomes this big movement, really, to just get out of the cities. It becomes really a status symbol as to where you live. And this has been around since the Model T became affordable to everyone. I don't need to live in the inner city anymore. I can move out of the city, and therefore that's a display of wealth as to where you live. Even today, certain neighborhoods are a certain status symbol as to where it is that you live. So the veterans, those young men and women, but young men who had fought in World War II, they come home and they really want to focus on, we are at the height of the classic American dream. I'm going to get married, I'm going to have children, we're going to live in a house, we're going to have a car in the garage, we're going to have maybe 2 cars in the garage, we're going to have the latest electronic set. We will represent what people think of when they come to America and they achieve the American dream. We're going to achieve it. This is sort of the heyday of this classic Americana. So the soldiers come home from the war, they're getting married, and what we find out is there's a massive, massive, massive housing shortage. The government had offered these different low-interest loans through FHA, as well as through veterans programs, to get these young men and their wives into houses so that they could raise these families, that we could be sort of this American image. And you began to see, because there was such a demand for housing, that this push for making the houses faster. And that's when you really start seeing these prefabricated neighborhoods. The most famous is called Levittown, and it's located in Long Island. It's actually founded and created by the Levitt brothers. And their idea is to make these cookie cutter homes. We have neighborhoods like this here in Washington and any town. The houses all relatively look the same. There may be a couple of different patterns you can choose from, but basically it's the same house. The reason builders do this is you can build them quickly, they are cheaper, and people sort of like that standardization. It's and you see it's called the McDonald's theory, the idea that no matter where you go, whatever McDonald's you go in, they basically look the same. Whether you go into one in Tokyo or London or Washington, North Carolina, you're pretty much going to be able to order the same thing. Sorry, you can see the stat, by 25% of Americans live in suburbs by the 1960s, these pre-planned neighborhoods. This is a picture of Levittown. Can you imagine having to tell somebody where you lived, but you couldn't give them the house number? They all look the same. And this is, and the big word for the 1950s is conformity. There is safety in conformity. There is safety in looking like everyone else. Because if you don't, well, we're pretty sure you're a communist. And if you are a communist, you definitely want to look like everyone else so that no one knows that you're secretly trying to undermine the U.S. government and bring down the nation. This is the drawing plan for the Levitt town. So there were two different styles you could have. Cape Cod House, which has, it tells you 4.5 rooms. The Levitt Ranch also has 4.5 rooms. Oftentimes, the Cape Cod would also have an upstairs as well. So a very popular style. Here is the classic American family. That was not supposed to happen. Okay, here we go. With dad, mom, junior. I'm going to call this a girl, but it might not be, and the other kid. The typical family had 2.5 kids. I don't really know how you figure that out, but they do. Aren't we happy? This leads to what's called white flight. White flight still happens today. White flight is the idea that when whites left the cities, they moved out of these areas because they were, because of the times, given more job opportunities. They had more ability to do things that the African Americans and the poorer whites were left in the cities and create this concept of what's known as the inner city, which will become, for many people, a symbol of despair, of poverty, of crime. And really in the 1980s, we'll talk more about that socially. The problem is that African Americans, because of discrimination, were not given those same rights. They didn't get those same loans. And so therefore whites are able to move to the suburbs because it's made more affordable for them. African Americans are pretty much, and at most times, denied. And if African Americans did move into the neighborhoods, often whites would start moving out for fear of their own racist beliefs. The post-war economy in the 1950s is booming. This is a rebirth of the 1920s economy. Things are just doing really well. There was this fear after World War II that when we weren't producing for a war, that all of a sudden the economy would just bottom out, but it didn't. Because again, once again, as Europe is rebuilding, who's funding that rebuilding effort? It's America. We're building the things and the supplies that Europe needs to rebuild. Additionally, our military spending doesn't go down like it had done after other wars. We're building military equipment almost as if we're preparing for war at a non-war time because the Cold War is going on. So how do we know that things are doing really well? Well, financial statistics show us that. 25% of homes in 1960 were less than 10 years old, which means we're constantly building new homes. We're having to keep up with demand. 83% of new homes were in the suburbs, so you're having to take new land and develop that into neighborhoods. Electronics start hitting this milestone mostly because Americans are using, or the government and scientists are doing research with which to be technology savvy with regards to the Cold War, and then the benefit is it kind of spills over into other things. It's called a transistor. Back in the day, you could take your radio with you. In the 1950s, it was really a new technology. It's about the size of maybe a smartphone today, but much, much thicker. And you could only get radio stations. And the device that allowed you to do that was the transistor. Transistors become Walkmans. Those held cassettes. Walkmans became Discmans, which held CDs, which eventually became iPods, which eventually became the fact that I think most people today use their phone for their music source. I am old school. I still use my phone for talking and internet usage, and I have an iPod that has music on it. The aerospace industry is increasing. Boeing builds the first passenger jet, the 707. So flying now becomes something that the average American can do. What's really interesting is that during this time period, and really the 50s, 60s, 70s, when people flew on planes, not only did they have actual leg room, and they could carry on their luggage without having to pay, but people dressed up. Going on a plane was a big deal, and you dressed for the occasion. Today, if I'm going to fly somewhere, I'm wearing the shoes I can take up off the fastest because of the checkpoints, and I'm dressed comfy because you're packed in there as tight as possible, and it's a miserable experience for everyone. Changes in the workplace. By 1956, we had hit a new milestone. White-collared workers outnumbered blue-collar workers. White-collared workers are those people doing desk jobs, your accountant, your person in the cubicle. Your blue-collar workers, your person in manufacturing. How do you account for this? What's the difference? It's education. You're getting a more educated workforce and a college educated workforce. Now, still at this time period, people really expected, and this happened. You started working for your company either out of high school or trade school or out of college, and you stayed with that company till retirement. You maybe switched once. People weren't switching careers. They got in there and they stayed because companies took care of their workers. The relationship between the company and the worker was totally different than it is today. You were not a number. Workers are always a means to an end. You were always the means to the finished product. But there was this real loyalty among businessmen and women, but businessmen, that they stayed with that company and the company took care of them. You got a great retirement package. They sent birthday cards to your kids, those kind of things. We don't see that anymore because the workforce has become so transient. I'm not happy in my job, I'm just going to move on. I'm not even going to give them a 2-week notice. The worker, the American worker has changed. But in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, and up through the 80s, this is the classic American worker who gets in there, does their job, and in return they are treated very nice by their employer. There's that loyalty. Women, it all changes here. This starts what's known as the second wave of feminism. I'm just going to say women's rights because that's probably the better term, actually. The first wave starts during the abolitionist era, Seneca Falls Convention, and runs through when women get the right to vote. Things sort of quiet down. The second wave starts right here in the 1950s after World War II. Women had gone out, they had worked in the factories, and they got that little taste of freedom. Outside of the home, they were seen as something other than just mom. And think about how many of us, and I even can say this in my age with my mother, you forget that they were someone before you existed. That they have this whole other personality to them that isn't just mom. Or how much your parents have sacrificed of themselves and their own dreams to make sure that you fulfill yours, that they put their lives on hold for you, and primarily it's mom, not dad. Because at this point in time, dad could still go out and have a life outside that role of mommy or parent. And women got to do that. They did it during World War I, but society just wasn't ready for that. Well, after World War II, women began to say, you know what? I'm unfulfilled being just mom. I want the option, and that is what it's all about. Which I just spelled wrong. Options. Having the choice to be a career woman, to be a stay-at-home mom, to be both. It's about options. And for so long, we had run on this cult of domesticity, that the woman's role was in the home. And women started challenging that. And as you can imagine, male-dominated society wasn't quite ready. They're sort of still not quite ready. In the 1950s, women were paid much less than their male counterparts for doing the same job, having the same education. Today in 2017, for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns 77 cents. So wage discrimination is real and it exists. Men and women are treated differently in the workplace, and that doesn't matter where you work. Guys, you may not notice it so much. Girls, you probably already do notice it, that you are treated differently than your male counterparts. Women often did what were considered traditional roles. What's interesting is the TV media, and we'll talk about this later on, probably in class, doesn't show this. It's still showing I'm at home cooking dinner with my pearls on. Um, it's not really that up to date. Betty Friedan was a housewife who was a very educated housewife, and she wrote this book called The Feminine Mystique. You need to know it. And she basically says, should women go and focus on a career? Should they focus on family? Can they do both? How do women sort of wrap their mind around the desire to do both? She was unfulfilled and she wanted that fulfillment. She wanted to go out and be something other than just mommy stay at home or wife stay at home. And can women do both? And the struggle women have doing both. Consumer culture definitely goes up in the 1950s. You begin to get something that supports things like, let's go out and eat at McDonald's. McDonald's comes out. Disneyland's out. Oh boy, the TV comes out. We got to have it all. We got to buy it all, just like in the 1920s. People are buying stuff on credit. Credit cards actually come out in the 1950s. They're extremely difficult to get. You just don't get them in the mail like you do today. With TV, people start going to the movies less. Now remember, the TV only has 3 channels. It only operates up to 11 p.m. at night. The nightly news is 15 minutes. Most shows are geared toward adults. You begin to get on Saturday mornings a show called Howdy Doody. It's a little puppet. He's kind of creepy. And other things geared toward children. There's no remote, so if you want to change the channel, you got to physically get up there and get it. Parents often controlled what was watched on the TV, so the kids didn't get to pick. There is no cable. There are no all whatever channels, no 24/7 news channels, no kids channels, no music channels, anything. We do see a rise in what are called televangelists. These are preachers who are trying to save your soul through the airwaves. Today, you get Billy Graham Jr. And Joel Osteen. Back then, it was Billy Graham Sr., Oral Roberts, and Fulton Sheen. And then we found out that sex sells. We learned it in the 20s, but not the way things came out in the 50s. You have Marilyn Monroe here, who was here, so I just pointed and y'all can't see, who's considered the sex symbol of the 1950s. You have this here, looks matter. Elvis Presley brings rock and roll to the masses, and boy, does it scare white parents. Rock and roll was born out of rhythm and blues. You can compare this to the rise of the jazz movement in the 1920s. The first time he goes on TV, they only show him from the waist up because he jiggles his pelvis in an alluring fashion that's going to make girls think bad thoughts. Marilyn Monroe becomes the film star and the pinup. She also is on the cover of Playboy, who at the time wasn't, I mean, Playboy's always been Playboy, but it wasn't what you and I would think of Playboy now. I mean, there's still nudity. They're both extremely controversial because they challenge the status quo. Think of what was seen as shocking in the 1950s and then what we have today. Women go out dressed up to a award show with plunging V necklines that are showing everything God's given them. You're looking at videos or music that has filthy sexual-based lyrics. In the 1950s, they're talking about holding your hand, and people thought that was scandalous. There are some critics of conformity. You really get what's called the beat movement. They're known as beatniks, led by people like Allen Ginsberg, who's a poet, Jack Kerouac. I'm going to spell it wrong. I know I spelled it wrong. Who writes On the Road. These people begin to question, why are we doing everything like everyone else? How is that benefiting society? Does it make people displeased with society? What about those that don't fit in? Why are we pushing people to conform when you were not really born to, you were born to stand out? Those people, of course, in the 1950s were viewed by the traitorous communists they were. That is said sarcastically. I'm skipping affluent society. Because I have time, I know on that slide it said stop. I'm going to go a few more slides, and then I'm going to cut this recording off and then record a second bit. So the election of 1952 is between Democrats nominee Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower with his Vice President Richard Nixon. Dwight Eisenhower had been a World War II hero He's simply adorable. His campaign slogan was, "I like Ike, and who doesn't?" And quite frankly, after years of Democrat leadership, and believe it or not, when FDR, by his third time election, he was popular, but not nearly as popular as he had been. It was waning. Democrats were sort of blamed for the spreading of communism. Republicans were seen as tough on communism. There is an issue with regards to Nixon. During the campaign, it was brought up that Nixon, during his time in office as a senator, had illegally taken funds. Nixon uses the TV to his advantage. He goes on and does something which we've seen 1,000 times now. It's the "I'm sorry" speech. He never admits wrongdoing. That never happened, but he's sorry the public would view him that way. Please don't take your negative view of Nixon and not vote for Eisenhower. Oh my gosh, it works. People eat it up. Now, it's never proven whether or not Nixon actually had illegally taken funds. Considering what happens in the 72 election, it's quite possible he might have done some dishonesty. But he's still seen as a very viable and effective politician. Election of 52, Eisenhower wins big. He promises he will go to Korea and work to settle the war. He does, but he fails to get an agreement. And then if you remember in the Korean War, that's when we threatened, well, MacArthur wants to blow it up, we don't blow it up. But the Korean War shows that we're going to uphold the Truman Doctrine. Eisenhower is, up until that point, the least experienced president of the 20th century, and that's still the case. Currently, the least experienced president of the 21st century would be Donald Trump, and they mean that by political experience, not quality or qualified to be in office, just political experience. He pursues a very modest domestic policy. He's the first Republican in 20 years. He's your typical Republican. He's going to focus on the business community. He's pro-business. He gets rid of regulations. He opposes any new social programs, wants to roll back anything that's left of the New Deal. He works to reduce the deficit and balance the budget, and he does. By his last year in office in 1960, we have $1 billion surplus. Don't worry, we'll ruin that. In case you were getting excited. I'm going to cut it off there mostly because of time, not because it's a decent stopping point. The next lecture for the life in the 50s, including 50s politics, will pick up on this slide talking about Eisenhower and republicanism.